Our next speaker is Tim Benton. And when I invited Tim last April to be a speaker in this conference, he sent me back the following mail. This sounds like a brilliant meeting, and it very much fits my own ideological approach about system thinking, complexity, grand challenges, and interdisciplinarity. Count me in. For a conference organizer, mails of this kind are the best you can get, especially if they are sent by one of the foremost experts in the world in the field of food systems, who can address the societal problems that arise when those systems are disrupted. So let us welcome Tim Benton and hear his talk, Food Systems and Their Fragility in a Global World.
Thank you very much. I better apologise in advance. According to my body clock, it's 6 o'clock in the morning and I haven't been to bed yet. So I've just been overdosing on caffeine and I might have done a little bit too much. So if I start swaying and not being able to speak properly, please blame the jet lag. Right. I'm going to talk today about food systems, globalization, risks, climate change, and a whole lot of things. And effectively, I'll probably not say, from a kind of message perspective, things that haven't already been said today, but I will say them in kind of different ways, and perhaps draw some conclusions that some of my fellow speakers will go at. But in the spirit of trying to say something about what we need to do to live in a world sustainably, because we haven't actually mentioned that in any kind of significant way this morning, but what we really need to do is make sure that we get to a stage where we tackle climate change. Otherwise, these risks will just carry on compounding and compounding and compounding. Oh, I see. Holding it the wrong way around. So I want to talk about food. I have spent the last 5 years working in the UK as a cross-government advisor, thinking about the challenges of food and the food system. And I left that role about a month ago, and I now work part-time at Chatham House, which is our international affairs think tank. And one of the reasons I became interested in food and the systemic risks associated with it is because food is such a cross-cutting issue that is much more than just getting calories on a daily basis. So we have to produce the food. Producing the food has all sorts of impacts on the environment, one of which is this is algae growing in the water that has been enriched by nutrients coming off fields as we grow things intensively. Food has all sorts of cultural issues. This is the French cockerel. Is the badge of France for sporting teams, and this is a poster about rugby, and they call the English the roast beefs. So we have two food symbols which characterize our national cultures. Food, we're used to being in a situation where food is super abundant. Food clearly has a cultural and familial value associated with it. In some parts of the world down here, people are absolutely starving hungry on a daily basis, and it's a real problem getting access for food. Some parts of the world, so this is in sub-Saharan Africa, food is also something that is like having a bank, the value of their livestock, because these people don't have access to finance in the way that we do. They keep all of their money in their cows. And so their food system is also their banking system. Throughout much of the world, I'll mention it in passing later on, malnourishment in the sense of having access to too many calories is driving a whole range of public health problems, obesity, diabetes. This is somebody who's had their toes amputated because they've had diabetes. In much of the developed world, because of growing income inequality, you have a whole lot of people who subsist on emergency food handouts, and so the food security issues in my part of the world are associated with food poverty and diabetes and obesity coming from having access to very cheap but very poor diets. This is an oil palm plantation, land use change, rainforest being chopped down, greenhouse gas emissions, and so on. And then finally, when things go wrong, and I'll talk about this quite a lot, when things go wrong, there's no such thing, the saying goes, a hungry man is an angry man, and it's the fastest way for social breakdown to happen is for food to become temporarily unavailable. And it underpinned some of the issues to do with the Arab Spring, which have led in part to the migration crisis in the Middle East, which is in part leading to the breakdown of the European Union through driving immigration across Europe. So food is not just about access to calories. Food is a systemic thing that underpins a lot of the way our societies work. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about the growth and the extent of the globalized food system. And I just wanted a bit of terminology. A food system, I've lost what is a food system up here. Food is produced, it impacts upon the environment of various sorts. Food goes into some sort of supply chain, ends up in a supermarket where we choose it, and it impacts our nutrition, health, and well-being. And our well-being is also impacted by the environments. And along the way, waste is created, which also has environmental impacts. That kind of totality is what I refer to as the food system. And one of the important things that is the subtext or the complete text of this talk is that food systems are spatial. So I looked up last night or this morning, whenever it was I was writing this talk, 90% of Singapore's food comes from about 30 countries. In the UK, about 60% of our entire food system's environmental footprint is overseas, and that comes from about 160 countries around the world. Our food system takes food, in the UK, takes food from about 87% of all of the world's countries. And increasingly, every country in the world relies on access to food coming from other countries. And I just wanted to start off by saying it isn't clearly it isn't an accident that we have a globalized trading system and the world that we live in as we do. And actually, it was a kind of deliberative policy post-Second World War, particularly driven by the US and the UK, to provide the means of open trade. From the UK perspective, it was because we were used to importing food from across our empire, the Commonwealth as it now is. And from a US perspective, it was because they wanted to have access to markets around the world to have the potential for economic growth driven by exports and increasing their market share. Oh, wrong way. And actually, some of the issues to do with the tensions created by driving international trade and free markets date back a very long way. So this is Lord Boyd Orr, who was the first chairman, the first director of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. He resigned after only about 4 years in post because he had a running battle about the extent to which trade liberalization was a good thing, and he decided at the time that it wasn't, because it wasn't supporting farmers enough, because they couldn't compete against the kind of might of the big producers like the United States. And I came across this quote the other day, and although it's not really to do with the talk that I'm going to give, I think there is a fundamental tension in our capitalistic economy driven by consumerism because we live on a finite planet. And a lot of what I'm going to come back to again and again and again is the fact that we live on a finite planet and we're expecting infinite economic growth from a finite set of resources. So my background is in theoretical ecology, and fundamentally I'm a Malthusian in terms of there is a limited amount of resources, and although you can innovate and become more efficient and you can use up those resources, you're always going to, at some stage, run into some limits of growth because of the finiteness of resources. And this quote, I think, is quite an instructive one in terms of thinking about the growth of our consumerist society. The bottom paragraph, we need things consumed, burned up, worn out, replaced, discarded at an ever-increasing pace. We need to have people eat, drink, dress, ride, live with ever more complicated and therefore constantly more expensive consumption. Our way of doing things was a choice at the time, and we have kind of got used to it. And I think we're going to be in the situation in decades to come where we have to revisit the degree to which material consumption is at the heart of what we want to do as a society. So, talking a bit about the growth of global food, I'm just going to show a few diagrams about the history of the development of the trade system. So these are just maps from a recent paper. The size of the edges of the lines represents the trade flows between different continents and different countries. 1960s, 1990s, very recently. You can see the way things that are advancing in terms of the situation that more and more food is getting transported around the world. So this is in dollar terms, not in biomass terms. As time goes on, the amount of income coming from trade is approaching the total value of the world's market. So that's suggesting that a lot of the food that is eaten actually comes from outside of countries because we're swapping it around. And when you plot this on a log scale, you get an increasing exponential curve. So we're living in a world that is getting increasingly reliant on food, transport. This is seafood being transported around the world, and this is two of our biggest commodity crops, wheat and rice. Now, if there are any kind of financial analysts in the room, one of the things that struck me when this paper was published by Mike Puma, I've done various bits of network analysis in my kind of theoretical days. This looks just like the network, the financial network connecting the banks just before the crash. So you have very high levels of interconnectivity with some very powerful nodes, the countries, that are effectively connecting everybody to everybody else. And for me, a diagram like that says that there is a risk associated with something going wrong just as much as it's a big interconnected trading system. And we are just starting to realize quite how big a risk that might be. So everything's connected, and things are connected not necessarily just in terms of transport of rice or wheat or seafood or meat, but also transport of ingredients. And I could show a million diagrams like this. This is just one with respect to soy. So a lot of soy is grown in places like Brazil, transported. This is putting Europe at the center because it's a European diagram. Soy transported to Europe, and then we typically take the soy and we feed it to livestock, and then we transport the livestock around the world in terms of meat or sometimes dairy as well. So we're transporting not just the raw materials, we're transporting the ingredients. And when you start thinking about all of the other things that we transport around in terms of packaging and embedded water and so on, we get very, very complicated networks. And of course, once you start thinking about the logistics of moving things around, then you start thinking about the fragility of our transport system. So this isn't a map. There are no edges to the coast drawn on here. This is just a picture of where boats have transported goods across oceans, and the tracks of the boats come from their GPS transponders. And clearly there are places like the Suez Canal where a whole lot of stuff gets transported. This is me flying in yesterday morning, boats just stacking up outside Singapore. And when you start looking and saying, well, where is the bulk of goods being transported, then you can see that there are a relatively small number of choke points, is the term that people are using at the moment, to say this is where transport is kind of funneled into a particular area. And of course, once you have a choke point, you also have a risk of if something goes wrong. So just highlighting, coming up through the Red Sea, about a quarter of the world's cereal trade goes through, about 20% of fertilizers go through, round here, we have 14% of cereals, about a quarter of the world's fertilizers, because a lot of them are made in China and then get transported around the world. And 50% of China's soy comes through just outside Singapore. So were something to happen to here that either temporarily blocked it or caused a transport system to have to divert, then strange things could happen. You know, clearly we've got a bit of an issue to do with the stability of the South China Seas. I've been very privileged to work with some very, very intelligent people in the UK civil service, so working for government. And they're really, really clever, but they often aren't very intelligent, very sensible in terms of being able to understand the kind of depth of the knowledge, the depth of the system, because they move jobs every year or two. And I had this conversation with a really, really clever bloke, and I said, in the Foreign Office, and I said, you know, what would happen if the Suez Canal got blocked? And he said, well, it would be a relatively minor thing. You'd just transport food all the way around the bottom. And I said, well, if you're transporting food all the way around the bottom, then that's taking twice as long. And he said, so? It just takes twice as long. I said, well, that's the equivalent of halving the fleet. So you could only transport half as much food around. And then the penny dropped, and he said, I see. That's really important then for the kind of the way the food system works. So it's not just about whether or not there are routes, it's also the time taken for the route and the capacity for replacing that. And one of the situations about our global trade system is that effectively everything's underpinned by the theory of comparative advantage. So in a stable world, what you should do as a country is produce what you're really good at, export it, and then use the money from exporting it to buy the things that you're not so good at growing, because that way you have the potential for making the most of what you can do. But one of the corollaries of that is that it causes, in a very efficient system, it causes a concentration of production where the comparative advantages. And this is a map of where the bulk of the world's calories are grown. So we have maize and soy in the Midwest, soy largely down here, and a bit of sugar, wheat largely from Europe, rice, palm oil, rice. Now, the first time I saw that map, I was, in a sense, surprised how little of the world's area produced so much of the world's calories. And it is so much of the world's calories. Nearly 2/3 of the world's calories come from just those three crops, wheat, rice, and maize. And when you add up just the next 4 or 5 crops, you get up to nearly 90% of the world's calories is grown in a few crops in essentially a few areas, and we transport it around. And because we are increasingly, because of this comparative advantage, relying on fewer crops from fewer areas, then we're all eating more or less the same thing. Increasingly, we're getting global homogenization of diets. So this is a statistical map. It's a statistical map, but it's a map nonetheless. Where points are close together, that means the points are similar. Where points are a long way apart, it means the points are different. And each point is a description in multivariate space of a country's diet. And what you can see, and this is the attribution has dropped off. This is Colin Curry paper in PNAS a couple of years ago. What you can see is that in the 1960s, the global diets were in a big area, and they're squeezing down into an ever smaller area, because increasingly, wherever you go in the world, we're eating rice, maize, wheat, palm oil, sugar, and this kind of small number of crops. So our global trade system is creating this very large interconnected system. It is creating global homogenization of diets, very, very, very intense agriculture in those areas that can produce a lot, and we're transporting stuff around the world, and we're all eating more or less the same thing. And this is creating another risk, which we're all starting to recognize, and this is the risk of if we're all eating the same thing and it's the wrong thing, then we are in problem space. And this is a recent paper that was published in earlier this year in The Lancet, and these are pictures showing global weight, body mass index, for different places around the world, but this is the global average. And what you can see, we've got the different colors go from the very, very obese down to the underweight down here. But what you can see is all of the contours are facing downwards. So this means that the population in the world, which is starving and seriously underweight, is becoming smaller. And that's a very good thing. But compensatorily, the population that is bigger is becoming larger. All of those things are going down. And now if you actually look, less than 50% of the world's population is of a healthy weight on a global basis. Over 50% of the world's population is malnourished. Mal means bad, nourished means nourished. So malnourished includes being overweight and obese. Over 50% of the world's population is malnourished to the point of potentially suffering illness. And that is creating a huge risk, externalizing the costs of our diet onto healthcare systems. So we have a globalized trading system that is creating concentration of food production that we're shifting around the world. It's driving diets. We're all eating the wrong sorts of things, and we're all getting sick because of it. And that's now. And then when you look into the future, we have expected population growth to go so that we're likely to add another 40% people by the end of this century. Global economic growth, if we carry on growing economically, will tend to drive, this is a historical pattern, will tend to drive increasing consumption of calories. So here we have this nice relationship. This is from a David Tillman paper in PNAS. As income increases, the calories that we demand goes up. So as the world population grows and gets richer, we're going to demand more and more and more calories. Now, it's not that people in the rich group, so this is largely developed nations, it's not that we're eating 9,000 calories a day. It is that we're eating 3,000 calories a day, and to get that 3,000 calories, including the meat, we have to feed 6,000 calories to pigs and chickens and cows and so on. So our total demand for calories grown from farming on a daily basis. The more meat we eat, the more we demand calories. So as time goes on, we have to expect more production of food, more trade, and this situation is likely to get more complicated. So that's the situation we're in. We have this big food system, lots of production of food, lots of transport, lots of externalities associated with diets and so on. So I now want to go on and talk about the threats that are posed from this food system. We tend to have thought over the last 30 or 40 years, and still there is quite a strong thread of this, that trade, this international open trading system, is a good thing. And it is generally a good thing. I'm not saying we shouldn't be trading in an open way. All we're starting to recognize is that there are systemic risks associated with this trading system. And one of the systemic risks, let's start off by saying, is that as we have got more complicated, every country's food system, perhaps with the exception of North Korea, depends on food production elsewhere in the world. Every country, perhaps other than North Korea. And clearly in a place like Singapore, you're very aware of this because you don't grow your own food. But for many countries, this has become so much part of the kind of, this is the way we do things, that it's stopped being recognized as an issue. If something goes wrong with our trading system, then it could go wrong anywhere in the world, and we could be harmed because we're not growing our own food anymore. And we're starting to recognise the risks because, as everybody knows, over the last decade, we have had two very big food price spikes. And this is just a measure over time of the variation in food price over a short window, the volatility of food price. And what you can see is that we've had very long, very stable food prices get to 2007-8, and suddenly things become much more variable. And this is a graph of food price itself over the two food price spikes over the last decade. Where there is a red vertical line is where there has been some degree of civil unrest in a country, food riots, and you can't see it, but the figures in brackets are where people have died. And certainly, as I showed in my opening slide, the peak here in 2010-11 was one of the reasons that got people out onto the streets in North Africa, sparking the Arab Spring. And then to come back to another thread that I'll be talking about in a minute, one of the other reasons that we had a destabilization of the Middle East was a long-running drought in Syria, inability for people on the land to have a career ahead of them because their farming was not productive, lots of migration of young men from rural environments into the cities, disaffected young men, unemployed, and again, we're in a situation where destabilization arises. So food, the volatility of food prices, and the interaction with climate change are absolutely instrumental in our global order. But one of the things that we keep on talking about, all of the speakers today are talking about, is the issues to do with effectively lots of things building up, pressure building up, lots of things going wrong. And I just want to flag a small handful of things that are risks to our system. One is, of course, soil. We can't have an agricultural system without soil, and over the last 40 years, the Green Revolution has rapidly and massively increased the amount of biomass we get out of the soil. It's increased yields enormously, but at a cost of soil degradation on a global basis. And now about 25% of the world's soils are degraded. If you take the amount of carbon in soils, and carbon's really important because it feeds the microbes, and the microbes are the ones that kind of glue bits of soils together so they don't blow away. If you look at the amount of carbon in soils, you can see all around the world it's red, and some of it in the very productive areas like like in Europe, and that is where soils are radically unhealthy. Where if you look at the rate at which soils are being eroded and lost, then anywhere that it's not deep green, so soils reform at something like 0.5 ton per hectare per year. So if you're losing more than 0.5 ton per hectare per year, you're losing soils. And if you can see on this map, other than under the rainforest, almost every bit of agricultural soil is unsustainably losing every area of the world is unsustainably losing soils. And some analysis suggests that there's probably only enough soil in the intensive production areas for another 50 or 60 harvests because we're losing soil at that rate. So imagine trying to have a world food system where we're trying to grow food, but we don't have any soil to do it. And then when you look at a whole range of other things, I could show you 100 of these different maps. The amount of nitrogen fertilizer that's being over-applied, the impact upon water, the risk of desertification, all around the world, biodiversity loss, there are things that are going wrong. None of those things that are going wrong in a very big stepwise way. It is this creeping normalization that we are degrading the environment a little bit at a time, and at some point in the future, that is likely to come back and bite us. And in the old days, if something went wrong, we always had the potential of bringing more land into agriculture because we had an excess of land. Now, This is a map from a recent paper published this year, looking effectively at where we had spare capacity for growing food if something goes wrong, and effectively where it's kind of ready browns, there's very little capacity. And on a global basis, there's only capacity in Central Africa and Eastern Europe, effectively. So if something goes wrong on a global system, it's very difficult to imagine where we would get our food from because we don't have any spare land, if we can't suddenly access it from somewhere else. But the biggest risk, and the one I'm going to dwell on for a little while this afternoon, is climate change. And I think one of the issues that means that we have a cognitive bias against climate change, to use the terminology that Peter was talking about this morning, is that we do not imagine, and scientists haven't been particularly good at spelling this out, what climate change is likely to mean for people. You know, if you talk about a 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 degrees global warming, people imagine that every day would be more or less the same, but 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 degrees hotter. But that's very, very far from the case. That 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 degrees global warming is effectively an average temperature, day and night, averaged over the years. And when it's hot, it could be very much hotter than 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 degrees. And this is a map from the UK Met Office for a 4-degree world, so towards the end of the century, if it's 4 degrees. And just to catch up on something that somebody was mentioned this morning, the Paris Climate Agreement relies on countries saying, we are going to reduce our emissions by this amount, the nationally determined contributions. If you add up all of the NDCs that countries have signed up to at the moment, it still puts us on course for about 3.3 degrees of global warming. So even if everybody does what they've said they're going to do with Paris, we are still in a territory which is quite dangerous. And I want to explain why it's quite dangerous. So this is a map of average temperatures at the moment. And climate change is going to be important for 3 reasons. Firstly, the change in the average change in the climate. So this is from a UK perspective, if we add 4 degrees to an English climate, that means our climate will be something like Barcelona, because we move effectively down this map 4 degrees to where the average temperature in England on an annual basis is just over 10 degrees. If you go to Barcelona, the average temperature on an annual basis is 14 degrees. So English climate might be like Barcelona. That's kind of what people normally imagine as climate change. But 2 other very important reasons why climate is important reasons why climate is important. The first is that there is the potential for very large-scale changes, non-linear changes, tipping points in climate. And no one in government, certainly within the European environment that I come from, is paying any serious attention to these tipping points. And just one example, which is a nice example from the food perspective, is that there is a circulation current, and I'll show a picture of it later, called the overturning circulation, which effectively drives a heat pump taking heat from the tropics up towards northwest Europe, the overturning circulation. Under quite a lot of models driven by the sorts of climate forcing that we're having, there is something like a 30% chance of that turning off over the next decades, sometime this century. If you look in the scale of centuries, it is much more likely than not that this overturning circulation will turn itself off by 2200. So if we carry on as we are, much like the sea level that Kerry was talking about, it's almost inevitable that the overturning circulation will turn off. If the overturning circulation turns off, then English temperatures are much more likely to be on par with somewhere up here than coming down here. And if English temperatures, if we become more like North Labrador, a recent study says what will happen is that we'll have a much stronger storm track, we'll have much deeper winters, we'll produce much less food in northwest Europe, the intertropical convergence zone will drop south, We'll lose rice production from here. We'll have more desert here. We'll have more heavy rainfall here. This area will dry out. And were that to happen, the world would lose about 30% of its food production. Losing 30% of its food production is unimaginable in terms of its consequences. So that's the second reason why climate change is important. The third reason why climate change is important, and we are starting to see this now, is the rise in extreme weather. And we can dance on the head of the pin about what extreme weather means, but actually it's weather that has the tails of the distribution, but typically it's associated with very high economic costs or very high impacts. And this is just data from the US. The number of, percent it says here, can't remember what it is, annual, sorry, I can't remember what this actually is. But what you can see is that if you put a linear regression through this, we have a more or less linear increase in extreme weather events. And those extreme weather events are driving a whole range of impacts upon our food system. And just as a couple of examples, in the same week last year, we had 2 of the strongest storm systems in different parts of the world. We have the drying out and the aridification of California, which on a global basis, Californian agricultural economy is in the top 10 in terms of producers on a global basis. Where I live in North Yorkshire, a 18th century bridge was washed away by extreme rainfall last Christmas. We've had the El Nino droughts and still in sub-Saharan Africa today. When you look at the disaster databases, you can see everything is going up. So what we have is a situation where climate change is going to be both change in the long-term climate, but sudden step changes in the way that the world works, but also increases in extremes. And one of the increases in extremes, or the potential that is increasingly worrying people like me, is the risk that the extreme weather in different parts of the world, which is all interconnected by our global climate, will lead to impacts upon more than one of these breadbasket areas. So if you remember, in this map, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 breadbasket areas around the world responsible for the bulk of the world's calories, and it is perfectly conceivable that over the next decade or two, 1 or 2 of these breadbasket areas will be hit by extreme weather at more or less the same time, leading to big reductions in yield. So just to show that this is not just a theoretical possibility, this is 2012, and in 2012 we had a severe drought in one breadbasket area, which is where maize and soy are produced. We had a drought in Eastern Europe, which was very severe, and in between, hot, cold and wet, we had floods over the UK, and we lost a lot of yields in the UK too. So, and the impacts extended down over here, increasing monsoons impacting upon rice production. So if we have something like this, but a little bit worse, it's very easy to imagine enough calories coming out of the global food system that something horrible would go wrong. And one of my colleagues was sufficiently intrigued by the chance of multiple breadbasket failure that he did some crop climate models, and I'm just going to show some of his results. This is Joshua Elliott from NASA. This is the global yield from coupled crop climate models for the top 4 crops, rice, wheat, maize, and soy, for the recent past, for the near-term future, mid-century, end of century. And this is under a situation where, as the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, as the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere increases, it acts as a fertilizer for plants because plants fix the carbon dioxide to make the sugar in photosynthesis. So you would expect, all things being equal, more carbon dioxide, then plants can be better metabolically active. So this is under full CO2 fertilization. And this black dotted line is historically a 1 in 200 year event, and a 1 in 200 year event loses about 10% of the world's calories. And what Josh's models suggested, this is under a best case scenario with full CO2 fertilization, is that as we go through time, yields are maintained, but what historically has been a 1 in 200 year event becomes much more common. And actually, although you can't see it on this diagram, this risk is now 3 times greater than it was in the last 40 years. So the risk of losing 10% of the world's calories is now 3 times greater than it was 40 years ago. It was over the last 40 years. So that's under full CO2 fertilization. This is under no CO2 fertilization. And reality is going to be somewhere between the two, because this CO2 fertilization only occurs if the plant is not limited by water, is not limited by nitrogen, or not limited by other things. Over much of the world's production, there will be limitations to do with water and nitrogen and so on. Somewhere in between is reality, but you can see climate change has the potential to have a very, very large impact on yields, and it could be that what is normally something that would be so scarce, 1 in 200 year event, that it would create global conniptions, could be happening as often as once a decade by the end of the century if things go wrong. This is all written up in a report, and if anybody wants it, I can give them the web link. So we have a situation where we've got this big globalized system that relies on us transporting lots of food around. We are degrading the environment. We are losing soils. We're losing biodiversity. The extreme weather is becoming more extreme. Climate change is threatening production systems. And all of that is adding together to create lots and lots of simultaneous stresses. We have just published in the UK something called our climate change risk assessment. And when we did that, I was part of one of the authors on the chapter about international risks. What we did was we kind of delineated the long-term impacts of climate change, global food production, water availability, food safety, plant diseases, unstable governments and instability and so on. The impacts of short-term shocks, disruptions to supply chains because of what happens if you lose a port, what happens if there is a drought and food goes down, disruption to agricultural production. Some of that can lead to displacement of vulnerable populations, violent conflict. And these two things together have impacts on any country. The UK was the focus, in terms of the food that comes in and out, food price volatility and how that impacts on the poor in your country, the health impacts in terms of access to nutrition, but also disease risk, the authenticity of food. So as food prices go up, there is a greater risk of food fraud because people can see a route to making money by substituting ingredients for another. As if international disruption happens, it changes labor markets and so on and so on and so on. So losing food because of climate change impacts on a short term or a long term is not just going to be our food prices go up, but has a whole lot of systemic impacts. So, systemic risk. One of the interesting things as this new field of thinking about systemic risk, and others are going to talk about this tomorrow, is trying to put in framework what this means for the way we think about things. And one of the systemic risks associated with all of this is, and Graziano da Silva, the head of the FAO, said this recently in a meeting, is the fact that we tend to think in disciplinary silos. So an agriculturalist might think about agricultural production. An energy person might think about oil prices. A health person might think about health. Whereas actually all of these things are likely to be interconnected. And this is a paper that somebody pointed out to me the other day that comes up with an interesting framework about how these risks interact together to create a larger systemic risk. And the idea is, and this is their figure for the food price spike in 2008, that you'll have a whole range of simultaneous stresses: diminishing land, extreme weather, rising demand for food, rising energy demand, this is the energy system, oil field decline, a return of investments declining, and so on. Those risks, those stresses multiply together to create overload on our local systems, in this case the food system, the energy system. And those two interact to create a food price surge, an oil price surge, which then those two interact to create a global food price crisis, which then has a whole lot of systemic problems associated with geopolitical instability, rising food prices, and so on. So the issue, I think, to do with our trade system and food is not that climate change is going to create an issue, but climate change is going to create a shortfall in food production, which is going to interact with a whole range of other issues. And unless we think systemically about how all of these things interact with each other, then we're always going to be complacent about the risks into the future. So, just to put it in context, the 2007-8 food price spike was partly fueled by a shortfall in production, which was partly because of a drought in Australia. And on a global basis, that was about 0.5% of the world's calories that weren't produced when we expected them to. But the fact that that happened at a time where food stocks were very low, and the fact that it happened at the time that some of these energy things happened, and the fact that it happened at the time when there was the biofuels mandate in the United States, which took food out of the food system and put it into an energy system, meant that all of those things interacted and food prices went up very, very quickly. So it's not just one thing, it is the way all of these things interact. And of course, somebody said this morning, the market works on a short-term basis, and the market is not necessarily rational in the way it responds. And what happened with the food price spikes of 2007, 8, 10, 11 is that governments naturally intervened to put their own population and their own food security first. And what that meant was that they put in export bans and said, we're not going to export because my country might need it. And so those other countries, and that's every bloody country in the world, that relied on having food on the open market, were suddenly uncertain themselves about whether they can get food. And that also contributed to the fact that the market perceived there to be a shortfall in production, and food prices went up and up and up and up. So, one of the things that we did in our extreme weather report is to think about what could go wrong and how our food system might respond. And one of the things that we are trying to promote for national systems and for the food system itself and retail companies within this is a sort of stress test of the food system. And the way that we thought we could encourage the stress test is to come up with some plausible worst-case scenarios. What would happen? What would the food system do? How would your government respond? How would your company respond were a sequence of events to happen, like on this slide? And I won't go through it in any detail, but this slide is a collection of things that are plausible going wrong at the same time, and policy responses by other actors protecting their national interests at the expense of international interests. And you could very easily see in a situation like this, where you're not certain that you can get hold of food for yourself, for your own country, that things would become very unstable. And were something like this to happen, food prices could go up very, very rapidly on a global basis. And it's not just us in the rich nations that would suffer. There are many countries in the world, partly because we have driven them to by policy decisions that we have made to ensure that they have access to finance. Many countries in the world, especially the poorest countries, are net food importers. So if you think about what happens if food prices go up, yes, we've got our own countries, but if you're an import-dependent sub-Saharan African country, you suffer too. Food prices will go up radically, you won't be able to access food, and the poorest in your society will really suffer. And also, food aid that comes into your country will go less far, because the US government giving you food aid can buy less food when prices are up to give you for the same amount of money. So that scenario that I was talking about with the extreme weather report was what would happen if we lost 10% of the world's calories and food prices would go up and a lot of people would suffer in global poor and local poor. But what would happen if this North Atlantic overturning circulation turned off? I just want to pose this to you because certainly my government says, well, it's an unprecedented event. It's a black swan event. It's never going to happen. We don't have to plan. But if there's a 20% chance of it happening this century, that means that there's a very real chance that it could be happening now. It's not a big chance, but it's a very real chance nonetheless. And were that to happen, this is a map of global heat relative to where we are now if that overturning circulation happened. And as you can see, this chunk of northwest Europe would go down nearly 10 degrees. So that would go from a central England temperature would go down 5 or 6 degrees. That would be the equivalent of going down from 10 degrees to 5 degrees. So that would be the equivalent of the central England temperature not coming down here like we expect with climate change, but effectively being the same as up here in northern Finland. So I mentioned that were this to turn off, we would lose about 30% of yields in Europe and would lose yields here and would lose yields here and would lose yields here. But one of the other things that happens is the intertropical convergence zone, which kind of runs across the equator, would drop south. And this is a map of cyclones, hurricanes, and a whole lot of other things, the big tropical storms. And what you can see is that this band in the middle, and Singapore sits nicely here, this band in the middle is the intertropical convergence zone. If that drops south, then Singapore gets hammered because you'll be right in the typhoon track. So this turning off the North Atlantic circulation might take 30% of the world's calories out. What do the poor people in the world do if food prices go up? They won't go up double, they'll go up triple or quadruple. The poor people in the world will really suffer, but there'll be a whole lot of indirect effects, like radical changes in the way that the storm system works, which will then drive a whole lot of things to do with your resilience because you're not used to having very large storm surges and very, very large storms, like might happen were this to occur. So, I'm going on far too long. Building resilience. There are lots of things we can do about building resilience, but one of the first things that we should recognize is that our globalized food system is a good thing, but it brings risks with it. My government refuses to recognize this at the moment. It is just saying that globalized trade system is a public good, essentially, and not that it comes with a whole range of different problems associated. And the second thing that you have to recognize if we are going to build resilience is, as Kerry was saying, unprecedented things do happen. So I remember having a conversation with a minister who effectively said, unless there is a 1 in 20 risk of it happening, I'm not going to bother, because it's only with a 1 in 20 risk is there is a chance of it happening while I'm in office, effectively. And that is no way to plan for some of these very serious events. So what can we do? We can do more fundamental research to better understand the risks. We can do more about adapting agriculture. We can do more about the functioning of international markets in a whole range of different ways. So, for example, the WTO rules that govern trade, they don't say anything. They say a lot about not putting on import bans and tariffs to do with imports, but they say nothing about export bans. And countries putting in place export bans, if there is an interruption to the market, amplify any price signal and make things worse. How do we build national resilience? There are many ways, and many different countries will respond in different ways, such as building greater self-sufficiency, diversity of stocking systems. How do we coordinate risk management? The ASEAN nations are doing this in a way that is actually exemplary for the rest of the world. Right, I just want to end for a couple of minutes about why we have to change the system and think about sustainability. Now, we've talked about sustainability for donkey's years, for a very, very long time, but it was crystallized in Brundtland's report that sustainable development is something that meets the needs of now without putting at risk the needs of the future. And in the Brundtland report, it's very clear that the needs of now refer to the world's poorest people. But too often, the needs of now are taken as whatever I want. So I might want to eat diets which are bad for me, and I might have the economic power to pay for that, but that's not what I need. What I need for a healthy life is different from what I need, i.e. want. So there is an issue, I think, from a philosophical basis about what we want versus what we need and what this means. So our food system, as I've said, now over half the world's population are malnourished because of our food system. And a third of the world's food, roughly speaking, is lost or wasted. So the total food production in sub-Saharan Africa is about the equivalent of what Europe and North America throw away on an annual basis. Now, I think there's a little bit of a moral issue there, but if we are driving so much environmental degradation, we are decreasing resilience because we're pushing all of these simultaneous stresses, surely there is an argument for saying, let's make our food system better by working on the demand side as well as the supply side. And part of the issue from the climate change perspective, although this is not widely appreciated and not widely talked about, is that the emissions from the agri-food system in carbon dioxide and equivalents, the emissions from the food system are about the same as lighting, car use, travel, washing machines, which are very carbon intensive, heating and cooling. And yet, when people talk about moving towards a low carbon economy, they talk about changing light bulbs or electric cars. Actually, changing diets is a much more powerful way of decarbonizing the economy than changing light bulbs or changing cars. And just as an example, this is a map of where it's red, calories are grown and fed to livestock. Where it's green, calories are grown and eaten. If we ate half the amount of meat in the world, it would be more or less the equivalent of getting rid of all internal combustion engines in cars. That sort of level of change in diet can have a very, very big effect. Actually, the calories that we feed to livestock would provide the entire calorie needs of the entire population of Asia. So when we're looking ahead at the challenges of the food system and the fact that we are getting very close to breaking point, one of the things that we can do is eat in a different way. Because what we have is a situation where we produce food unsustainably, we make it very cheap so we can waste, overconsume, and it has a very high environmental impact. And when you do just a back-of-the-envelope calculation, a third of the world's food is fed to livestock, a third of the world's calories are lost or wasted, and about a third of the world's population overeat calories by about 20% each day. When you put all of those loss factors together, only about 40% of the world's calories that are grown are actually used for nutrition for healthy people. The rest is lost or wasted in different ways. So if we're coming close to the breaking point for the world's food system, there is an awful lot of scope in terms of increasing the efficiency of the food system as a whole by changing diets, reducing waste, and so on. And this leads to a whole new agenda called sustainable nutrition. And certainly in Europe, where the healthcare costs of poor diets are growing and growing and growing, thinking about how we can get a healthy and efficient, sustainable food system pay the full cost of food, so we're not externalizing cost to the health system or to the environment, and therefore sustainable production. And part of this full cost of food would be, for example, carbon pricing applied to food. If we had carbon pricing applied to food, the amount of meat that we would eat naturally would go down. And around the world, every region of the world, including sub-Saharan Africa, overeats protein relative to healthy values by a few percent in the case of sub-Saharan Africa, or a very large percent, 3 times in the case of the US. Okay, so 2 game changers just to finish. First was Paris, the climate change agreement that was mentioned this morning. The climate change agreement limits us to 2 degrees, theoretically. And at the same time, we had the SDGs, and the SDGs' 2 top goals, people and planet, end poverty, and planet. We are determined to protect the planet from degradation through sustainable consumption. So there's a recognition in the SDGs that we have to think about consuming in a different way as well as producing in a different way. And then, as lots of people have said, growth of popularism, growth of the right, growth of protectionism. This is Nigel Farage, who's a UK politician who has led the UK Independence Party, which has agitated for us to leave Europe. And of course, that's Mr. Trump. So just to end with, thinking about the future of food, as I have outlined, this is some work I've been doing with the World Economic Forum. As I have outlined, business as usual doesn't work. Somehow, if we are going to live in an equitable way without all of these risks getting out of control, we have to be moving towards this end, that we're eating healthily and low emissions, not degrading soils, not degrading water, not losing biodiversity, because otherwise, in the long run, we won't be able to grow enough food to keep us all healthy and happy. This axis here is a big unknown about the future of food. Will we carry on, as we have over the last 30 or 40 years, into a free trade global markets, or will we retract into much more local or regional trade? And I won't dwell on any of the details, but you can imagine completely different food futures and the future of the food system in each one of these situations. And effectively, this is the business as usual. This is where we're going, towards rampant climate change, rampant ill health, rampant inequality, driven by the way the system is at the moment. Okay, so I think I'll end there. Systemic risks to the global food system are underappreciated. They are part of a whole host of simultaneous stresses that are building. We need strategic action to bring about food system resilience. This needs a whole government approach, as was mentioned this morning by Mr. Ho. One of the challenges is that the Minister of Health doesn't talk to the Minister of Environment, who doesn't talk to the Minister of Climate Change, who doesn't talk to the Minister of Farming. So we have complete policy incoherence. And actually, to build a resilient system, we have to get much more coherent about our approaches. Our trade network carries benefits and risks. There is no magic bullet in terms of how do we make our system resilient. Existing emissions trajectories are problematic because of, for example, the tipping points. And in the long run, I can't see any other way other than reducing demand in some way to build a sustainable system where we manage these risks from a demand side perspective. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there questions? Yes, quite a few there.
Thank you very much for this very rich lecture. So I have one question. This is about GM. And this become dominating in food and other type of industry, such as animals and human and all the rest of it. So I have 2 little questions. One is that, can you show a map on how much GM on the world scale that has destroyed nutrition and other things that go along with it? The other one is that I like to find out what is the projection of the future of the whole food system in the daily life. The reason why I asked this question is recently I saw this map in London. It was showing in RCA. It's about how do people cook at home, and there's a food market, and they are actually redesigning the whole system in London. So starting with central London. So I'd like to hear your comment. Thank you.
Okay, GM. There isn't any evidence that GM has been bad for nutrition on a personal basis. So GM is typically, to date, associated with the big commodity crops. And the hope is that it will increase yields on the big commodity crops. That has an indirect impact upon nutrition because it makes calories cheaper because they're grown more efficiently, which then drives malnutrition in terms of having more calories than you need, and so on. So there might be a negative impact. There's some evidence about GM driving negative environmental goods because it is effectively creating change in pesticide usage and so on. I think there is enormous potential for GM technology, but there are also quite a lot of risks, and some of those risks are social risks in terms of, am I in charge of the food that I eat, or am I not? And certainly in Europe, it's that issue about food sovereignty, about my ability to eat what I want to eat and not have it contaminated with a technology that I don't want associated with food. That is the driving issue. So that was your first question. I can't show you a map, but there is lots of GM going on all around the world. Your second question was about food systems. Under each one of these different potential food futures, there are different relationships between people and technology. So effectively, I can imagine a future where food prices go up, and a lot of the food that most people eat in the Western world, at least, is processed. And the reason it's processed is because that adds value, and people buy the convenience, and that adds profit for the supply chain. If food prices go up, then people might go back and saying, that convenience is too much, and I'll go back to cooking. So one future is that we go down more of a convenience route, and we carry on with processed food and ultra-processed food, and we forget how to cook. And there are examples of that in various places around the world. And the other future is that we go back towards having a more traditional food system where people shop in markets and buy raw ingredients, and they take them home and they cook them. Both of those two things are possible. To go to your other question, the subtext to your question, a lot of cities around the world are grappling with how that they will deal with the twin problems of food availability and public health associated with diets. And many cities around the world are trying to develop a localized, sustainable, so typically relatively short supply chains in their mind, food system. And the progress towards thinking about food in an integrated way by cities is much, much greater than by governments around the world, because they are, in a sense, much closer to people. So there are lots of interesting experiments by lots of cities around the world about trying to develop new food systems and incentivize things in different ways. I think come back in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, and there will be lots of interesting lessons to be learned, but it's too early to say whether or not those are fashionable fads to cater for middle-class needs, or whether they're actually going to have traction in changing things.
Hello, my name's Honor. Thank you for the fascinating talk. I just wanted to come back to your point on soil degradation, which I was not so familiar with the kind of the looming sort of apocalypse of soil degradation until relatively recently. What's the kind of current thinking about how devastating that problem is and what can be done on both a local, regional, and perhaps kind of international level about that problem?
So the current thinking is a very large number of soil scientists are absolutely terrified and rather few governments care. It's the same, this is, this long-term incremental change, et cetera, And two anecdotes. I had a discussion with a UK minister a few years ago, and I said, look, soil quality is going down. And he said, well, if you draw a line through your relationship, when do you think things will get really bad? And I said, I don't know, because I don't know whether we need this much soil or this much soil, and I don't know whether we're going to have a big Dust Bowl event or whatever. And he said, well, work it out and come back to me a couple of years before you expect it to become catastrophic. So, that's effectively the issue, that we know we're losing biodiversity. We know we're losing soil biodiversity. We know we're losing soil structure. We know we're losing soil carbon. We know that the risk of extreme events that will erode soils are going up as all of those other things are going down. And we know it's perfectly possible to restructure soils and invest more carbon in them, but that comes with a cost. And my government is fully aware of these arguments, and yet it's just about to publish a 25-year food and farming plan. And that food and farming plan is going to drive intensification, because Northwest Europe is one of those places where we can produce more food relatively easily and export it to countries around the world which are going to suffer from climate change. So there's a market there, and my government is saying, let's exploit that market and we'll worry about the soils in the long term. It's just like climate change, it's just like all of these other.
Yes.
Tim, thank you. Si Ching here from Civil Service College. Could you share more about ideas that would stop the instinctive, fearful response of exporting countries stopping to export in times of crisis and food shortages, which are bound to happen? If you could talk a little bit more about that. And secondly, I was wondering if you could also talk about the role of businesses, the role that corporates play with regards to food supply and sustainability, because there are quite a few big players in the food business.
So the issue to do with stopping export bans or putting international interest above short-term national interest, I think there are two, and both of these both of these ideas arose in discussions I had in China recently. The first is that if something goes wrong and you put in place an export ban and that dries up international food prices, yet you rely on a global trade situation in good years, then what you're doing is you're upsetting your trading partners to protect your national interests. And once you get over that, you can expect some sort of punitive damages from your trading partners back to you in future. So there's a reciprocity about saying, I shouldn't put my short-term national interests first. I should take a bit of a hit, because otherwise my trading colleagues will come back and get cross with me next year or the year after. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, all around the world, part of this drive towards globalization has been also a reliance that the market will be able to give you back if something goes wrong. So there is the expectation that the market will work in almost all circumstances. If you say, actually, there are chances that the market won't work, then you go back to what we used to do, which is to have local food stores, and you always then have a fallback. And if then there is a shortfall in production, you don't necessarily have to stop exports or stop international trade, because there are stocks. And the only reason that we don't have stocks anymore is because the market was seen as a cheaper, more efficient mechanism. But the market is only a cheaper, more efficient mechanism if it works. And the argument that I have with people in government is, how much of a perturbation does it take for the market really not to work? And then it becomes a matter of ideological faith, whether you say it's 10% of the world's grain or 20% of the world's grain or whatever. So reciprocity and food stocks are the two obvious things that would be the answer.
Prof, thank you. The missing link you didn't mention about currency fluctuation, for example, the commodities, volatility, the question of rise of population, that 3 factors. And the question is that vis-a-vis the national security policies of the bigger consumption nation like China, India, and Africa and things like that. How do you see that, the question of the interplay of this counterbalancing could well be monitored and be extended to government to ensure that, feasibility is sustainability, whereas, instead of just policy which in fact does not draw the conclusive impact of expectation of this nation, because the third world and the first world policies are different and they do not normally share common interests. How do you ensure that, the FAO govern this particular instrument to the best of humanity? Thanks a lot.
Well, I think if we knew the answer to that, the world would be a very different place. I'm going to rely on Sean to answer that question tomorrow, because he's talking about global governance and what works and what doesn't. But that issue, effectively, and we're seeing it with Trumpton at the moment. Sorry, we're seeing it with North America at the moment. What they're doing is saying we're going to take a short-term economic advantage by increasing climate change and hurting everybody else. And while we're in a situation where nation states are effectively competing, we either move all together or you have cheats in a game theoretic sense. And that creates an awful problem. And I am not certain, Sean's the expert in this, I am not certain how we will get an international governance mechanism that does not put short-term interests, economic growth, competition first, and intergenerational equity, because this is an intergenerational equity, should be at the heart of what we're doing. I'm concerned about my children and my grandchildren, whereas most of the policymakers are concerned about what do we do now to beat China this year or next year or whatever.
Hi, Mary Dalale from the National University of Singapore. So thanks for the presentation. You really had your focus on climate change, and then the final slides were on the waste and the fact that basically we produce enough, but just the way it is distributed is just bad. So based on that, I have the feeling that many people tend to not look at the right question, which is how it is distributed. And I think that it goes back to the interest of the market, even of academia, or even of big international institutions, because this is how the Western world make money,
Yep.
kind of. So my question is, why do you think there is such a focus on climate change? And what do you think of this kind of wrong question being asked at the start, meaning asking from the perspective of climate change instead of asking about on the issue of the interest of markets? Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure I understand your question, but let me have a stab. So we have designed this system based on promoting consumption and globalized trade. We have built this system. We could build another system if we can get our head around how to govern that other system. As you've just said, we can produce enough food now to feed us all happily and healthily. If we carry on saying everybody in the world wants, and as soon as they have the economic power, we should provide diets and access to food like we in the rich world have, then that is driving us into a situation where we are promoting runaway climate change, we are promoting rampant ill health. And although in the short term, there's lots of profits to be made in that in the way the market is, in the long term, that might result in us only being able to provide food for 7 or 8 billion people, because if we lose 30% of the world's calories because of a tipping point going past, then price will act as a rationing mechanism and only the rich will survive. So should we have a system now that is about the market delivering what we want, or should we try and engineer the system so that the market is a combination of demand, market actors, so the suppliers of the demand, and policy? Should we try and engineer that system to provide what we need rather than what we want, so that in the long run, there is space in the world for all of our children to live and not just for us to have what we want now? The question of climate change, I think, is really, it's interesting from a food system perspective, because you can so clearly see the risks associated with climate change for the food system. And unlike energy systems, we can imagine ways of transforming our energy system into the future as climate change happens, adaptation. When it comes to the food system, it becomes much more difficult to think about, if we have runaway climate change, how will we actually adapt agriculture to provide the food that we're carrying on demanding? So you end up in a Malthusian situation that with climate change increasingly biting, the amount of food in the world that we can provide is likely to go down, and at some point, those two lines will cross. The issue to do with climate change and the science is that we started off with a science argument around, is climate change happening? Now we're trying to transfer that knowledge. As Kerry was saying, we've got 40 years of science behind all of this now. Now we're trying to transfer that into the policy domain. And I think we've been on a journey with respect to science and understanding what sustainability means. And on a global basis, the Paris Agreement effectively says we are unsustainable if climate change is going past 2 degrees. That's what we've agreed. And the 30% of greenhouse gases coming from the food system means that we break the entire Paris carbon budget with food, nothing else, just with food, within 20 years. So our food system is no way can be described as sustainable. So we have this issue to do with, do we want to live on a sustainable planet so that our children can have something like we have today? Or do we want to carry on short-termism, eating the food that we want, demanding the food that we want, and relegating our children and our children's children to a world which is much more likely to be unstable, much more likely the poor will suffer? And I think that is something that we don't tackle very well, either as a society and certainly not as government.
Good afternoon, John Lee here. Tim, it looks like to feed a hungry world with the demand for food growing fast, the quick and fast answer seems to be genetic engineering, GMO. But the challenge here is that the company with this capability are the big giants, the like of Monsanto, the DuPont, and the Syngenta. How do we avoid a situation whereby we place into the hand of such big players, because it is a universal problem, and that the poor farmer, maybe in India or in Pakistan, would not be able to handle this giant because they are capable of producing sterile seeds that after you grow once, you cannot harvest it to be sold again. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm personally agnostic about technology in terms of all technologies can be used well or used badly. I think certainly with CRISPR-Cas9, the ability to move and edit genes rapidly in a very rapidly changing world is probably going to be beneficial. The issue, I think, about big agriculture is an interesting one, because we have designed the system to promote global markets, which means that inevitably that leads to concentration of power, which leads to inequity. Now, it's perfectly possible to imagine rules and regulations and a market working with much more equal, inclusive growth. Now, whether we collectively have the desire to transform the system, or whether we will go through a big, effectively revolution, perhaps caused by climate change, or perhaps caused by geopolitical instability, perhaps caused by Mr. Trump, who knows. You can imagine ways in which the system would transform. But I don't necessarily think that GM equals automatically big agriculture, which equals inequality. Because certainly some of my colleagues can do gene editing of crop plants now using an MSc project in a 3-month lab placement. So it's going to become kind of garage technology at some point in the future. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's got to be big agriculture anymore.
One last question, Roland.
What proportion of food is wasted after somebody has eaten part of it? And what proportion of it is wasted in transporting it to wherever it goes? In other words, how is the waste divided up? Because plainly, one thing we can solve more easily than the other.
Yeah, it's very context dependent. Typically, in the developing world, most of the loss or wastage occurs somewhere between just before harvest to post-harvest losses in storage and so on. So that's kind of early in the supply chain. In the developed world, and we've got very good data in the UK compared to some countries, about most of the wastage is in the home. And some of that's associated with throwing food out because we've just bought too much and it goes slimy in a bag, or we can't read the labels and we can't see when the date is, etc., etc. Some of that is overproduction of food in the kitchen and throwing away. The other thing about in the developed world is that we are actually now increasing losses on farm because we are saying, oh, look, it's a misshapen potato, we don't want it, or this is a crop of carrots and they've got blemishes on the skin, so plough them back in. So in Europe, the losses are about equal in the home and on farm, but that on-farm bit is just driven by effectively food policy plus supermarket regulation around what they will accept in terms of blemish-free. And it's both of those are certainly fixable. But it then comes back down to this question, which is kind of fundamental to some of the things I was saying. How much is what a consumer wants as a determinant of the market? Clearly, it is the determinant of the market, but how much do we let that run freely when, in the long run, our children and our children's children suffer from allowing consumerism to be too rampant in a finite world? It's quite an interesting one to think about for neoliberals.
Okay, let's thank Tim once again.